Let me begin this episode with a question. If another major conflict erupts in Europe tomorrow, not Ukraine, but something new, something bigger, something that pulls NATO directly into a shooting war, who actually fights it first? Not morally, not politically, militarily. Think about it for a second, because here's the deeper question. Would Europe even be ready if America hesitated to join that conflict? For the first time in generations, European leaders are being forced to plan for that possibility, not as a thought experiment, not as a policy paper, as an actual military contingency. And once that kind of doubt enters the system, everything related to the global order changes. Hello everyone, my name is Raman and this is my show, The Raman Effect. For 75 years, European defense was built on a single unshakable assumption that the United States would always show up when necessary. NATO was not just a treaty, it was a psychological architecture. The American commitment was so deeply embedded in European planning that most countries did not even bother building the capacity to fight without it. And then that certainty cracked. During Donald Trump's first term, defense guarantees were framed transactionally. Burden sharing became a public argument. Military aid debates got politicized. And then in early 2025, something happened that made the theoretical very concrete. Trump administration briefly cut off satellite intelligence sharing with Ukraine and used it as political leverage. That was not just a diplomatic move, that was a signal. And every European defense ministry received that signal. See, you need to understand one thing. In geopolitics, you don't need abandonment to change behavior, you only need uncertainty. And the numbers that followed tell you just how seriously Europe took that signal. EU defense spending hit a record 343 billion euros in 2024, already rising sharply after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But after the American signals of 2025, the trajectory went vertical. At the June 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, allies agreed to something that would have been unthinkable even 2 years earlier, a target of 5% of GDP on defense-related spending by 2035, with 3.5% going to the core military expenditure. To put that in perspective, even during the Cold War, most European countries were not spending at those levels. Some people argue that it is unnecessary panic, but Europe is not panicking, it is recalculating. And recalculating is a much more dangerous thing, because panic fades, but recalculation changes institutions. Now, spending money is one thing. Building actual military autonomy is something else entirely. Because autonomy is not a speech at a summit. It's not a press release about rising budgets. Autonomy means you can deploy forces rapidly, sustain high-intensity combat, share intelligence seamlessly across borders, coordinate command structures across 27 different militaries of Europe, and scale industrial production to wartime levels. You see the gap? And that gap between intention and capability, that gap is enormous right now. Start with intelligence. The United States operates almost 246 military satellites. European NATO members? 49 combined. Building enough space-based surveillance to operate without America would take Europe at least 5 to 10 years minimum. And that is assuming the money flows without interruption. Then there is the industrial base. And this is where the problem becomes structural. Europe does have a defense industry, it is not small, but it was built for a different era totally. One where national governments funded national companies to produce national weapons. That legacy has never been fixed. 6 European countries manufacture their own main battle tanks. 11 build their own infantry fighting vehicles. 10 other countries build their own warships. Each country runs its own procurement system, its own specifications, its own supply chains. But how does that actually matter on a battlefield? If you are a defense aficionado, you certainly would ask that question. Think about it this way. When NATO countries sent Howitzers to Ukraine, they sent 10 different types. 10 different firing mechanisms, 10 different ammunition calibers, 10 different maintenance procedures, 10 different training programs. Ukrainian forces had to learn to operate all of them simultaneously on an active battlefield under fire. That is not a logistics challenge. That is a logistics catastrophe. The United States, it makes one standard howitzer, one system, one training pipeline. When American units deploy together, everything is compatible by default. That is the difference between having a defense industry and having a defense ecosystem. Europe has dozens of industries, but it does not have an ecosystem. And it's not just howitzers. Different countries run different tank models, different communication systems, different logistics software. If 27 European armies had to fight together at scale tomorrow, they would spend the first weeks just figuring out how things work on an active battlefield. The European Paramilitary Research Service estimates this fragmentation costs somewhere between 18 and 57 billion euros every single year. That's not a budget gap. That is a structural tax on disunity. And this is not a new problem. Europe has tried to fix it before and failed. Back in 2007, the EU set a target. Member states should procure 35% of their equipment collaboratively. Nearly 2 decades later, the actual number is still under 20%. In 2023, they launched yet another initiative, 310 million euros to incentivize joint procurement. Sounds meaningful until you realize total EU defense spending that year was over 300 billion. That incentive was a rounding error. Every time Europe has tried to integrate defense procurement, national interests have won, and that pattern has not broken yet. And this is where it gets structurally very interesting. Can 27 democracies fight like one military? Because right now, they don't even agree on what the threat looks like. I'll explain that. Poland looks east and sees an existential danger. Russia is not a theoretical problem for Warsaw, it's a memory. Poland has more than doubled its armed forces since 2014, from roughly 100,000 troops to over 216,000, making it the largest military in Europe and the third largest in NATO behind only the United States and Turkey. It's spending 4.7% of GDP on defense, the highest in the alliance. It has ordered 486 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, the HIMARS rocket launchers, and by 2030, its tank fleet is planned to be larger than Britain, Germany, France, and Italy combined. Poland is not hedging. Poland is preparing for a land war. And Germany, meanwhile, is trying to become something it has not been since 1945. A military power. Chancellor Merz loosened their constitutional debt brake for defense, unlocked a 500 billion euro infrastructure fund with clear military applications, and set a 2026 defense target of 108 billion euros. That is nearly double what France is spending. The stated goal is to make the German army the strongest conventional army in Europe. And Germany even passed a new conscription bill in late 2025. And then you look south. Spain's defense budget was flat for over a decade. Italy only recently returned to 2008 spending levels in real terms. The Mediterranean belt sees migration and instability as its primary security concern, not Russian tanks rolling through the Baltics. So if you were Spain, would you prioritize Arctic defense? If you were Poland, would you wait for Southern Europe to finish debating? These are not hypothetical questions, they are the fault lines that make European defense integration so difficult and complex. And then there is the hardest problem of all. I call it the nervous system problem. Modern war is not just soldiers and tanks, it's a nervous system. Satellite intelligence, real-time surveillance, air refueling, strategic airlift, integrated command networks that allow different forces to operate as one organism. For 75 years, Europe's nervous system was American. NATO's command architecture, its space-based reconnaissance, its missile warning systems, its strategic lift capacity, all of it was built around the United States as the central node. That was not a flaw, that was the design. America provided the enablers, Europe provided the geography and the ground forces. And it worked brilliantly as long as the central assumption held, that America would always be there. But here's the structural trap. To build autonomy, Europe doesn't just need to buy more jets and tanks. It needs to replicate or restructure an ecosystem that took 75 years to build. Germany has announced 35 billion euros for military space capabilities over the next 5 years. The EU is developing its own Earth observation system for defense, aiming for operational capability by 2028. But realistically, European self-sufficiency in space-based intelligence is still a decade away at best. And here's a paradox that makes this even harder. The more Europe spends on defense, the more it currently buys from America. US foreign military sales to European allies jumped from about $11 billion annually before 2022 to $68 billion in 2024. Every F-35 purchased, every Patriot battery deployed, every HIMARS system ordered deepens the operational dependency on the United States. Europe is simultaneously trying to become independent and becoming more entangled. This is not a contradiction born of incompetence, it's a structural reality born of urgency. When you need equipment now, you buy what is available and what works. And what works right now is American. This reminds me of a concept in geopolitics that can be attributed to this situation. Autonomy demands integration. Integration demands political will. And political will demands something Europe has never had to produce before: a shared willingness to project power. Not just coordinate it, not just fund it, project it. Because without that, autonomy is just a slogan. This is where the story moves beyond hardware and budgets. Europe's identity for the last 3 decades was built around a very specific idea of power: regulatory influence, economic leverage, soft diplomacy. The EU was designed to be a normative superpower, not a military one. Becoming a hard power changes everything. It changes budget priorities. When defense spending hits 3.5% of GDP, something else has to give. The UK is already cutting overseas development aid to fund military expansion. Estonia has increased its fiscal deficit. Germany is loosening debt rules it once treated as sacred. It changes political narratives. A continent built around welfare states and social contracts is now debating conscription and missile production. Can you believe that? A continent that defined itself by what it would not do is now being forced to define itself by what it must. Now, everything we've talked about so far, the budgets, the fragmentation, the dependency, the political fault lines, all of that is real. And all of that will take years to resolve. But there is some other gamble happening underneath all of it that deserves attention. Because that gamble Europe is making is not just military, it is civilizational. France is moving first in that gamble. President Emmanuel Macron is not talking about autonomy anymore, he is acting on it. Paris wants Europe's defense billions building European power, not flowing across the Atlantic. And then came the real signal. France put its nuclear deterrent into the European conversation. Not as a replacement, not yet, but as an option. That changes everything. Because once France's vital interests start sounding European, this stops being about budgets. It becomes about who leads Europe. Now think about what's already in motion. Germany, a country that constitutionally chained itself to pacifism after 1945, just amended that constitution to spend without limits on defense. Its chancellor has publicly declared the goal of building Europe's most powerful conventional army. That sentence alone would have been politically radioactive 5 years ago. Look at Poland. Poland is restructuring its entire society around the assumption that a major land war is not hypothetical but probable. Plans for military training for every adult male in the country. Defense spending written into constitutional law. These are not reversible moves. You don't amend constitutions, restart conscription, and restructure industrial economies as a temporary measure. Even if the American commitment stabilizes tomorrow, the institutions being built now will outlast the crisis that created them. And that is the real gamble. Europe is not just trying to become capable of fighting, it is becoming something new in the process. A continent that ran on soft power for decades is rewiring itself for hard power. And that rewiring will change its politics, its economics, its alliances, and its sense of self in ways that nobody can fully predict. The last time Europe armed at this scale, it reshaped the entire global order. The question is not whether Europe will spend the money, it already is. The real question is whether Europe can become a hard power without becoming a different Europe. Because once power rewires a continent, there is no going back. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next episode.